So, hi everyone, my name is Sarah Jane Potts and I'm a research engineer working at Specific Information Knowledge Centre in Swansea University. I specialise in printed electronics, particularly in things like printed PV and resistive heaters. But today we will be looking more at fascinating fluids which you can find around your home, which funnily enough does actually link to my work, as without that understanding, you won't get things like printed electronics or PV or so many other things that you may take for granted in your lives. So coming up, we're going to go through a brief introduction of what sort of fluid types there are. So things like Newtonian fluids and non-Newtonian fluids and what types there are. And then we're going to take a little journey around the house whilst all staying in our one place. So we'll go through some fluids that you may find in the bathroom and the different properties they have. And then some things we can find in the kitchen. And then finally, some things you may find in the bedroom, or at least you will definitely find in my bedroom, or maybe a shed if you store your stuff in a slightly different place. And I'll give you a quick summary, and then for those of you who are joining me live, you'll have a quick Q&A session. So let's start. Newtonian and non-Newtonian fluids. So when we're talking about fluid types, we're referring to its flow properties. So a key property in here is viscosity. So this is a liquid's resistance to flow. So if I were to stir something, how readily would it flow? How easy would it be to flow? Do I have to put a lot of strength in to make it flow around? Or will it just flow around me like water? So this was defined by Newton as a force per unit area of shear stress. So this is the stress being applied to shear a fluid, like what I'm doing here, trying to shear bits of my skin off of my hand. Maybe not a great example, but great one if you have loose skin. And this is required to produce a steady and simple flow, as given in the Newtonian equation in the center here. So this symbol here, this is viscosity, and then we have shear stress and shear rate. And then if we were to simplify this, could also be seen as the shear stress is defined as a change in velocity for a given change in distance. So this is difference in rate, this different distance. So these are different ways of looking at how a fluid moves, similarly to how you would look at stresses in terms of a solid. So if I were to apply a stress to my hand, I would take my little finger, this is my force, and my unit area is a little area of my finger. So when I push down, it will create stress on my hand. Not anxiety, as some of my students have caused it, although if I were to apply a stress to my temples for long enough, I think that would make me feel a little uncomfortable and anxious as well. But yes, so these are the fundamental equations behind it. So most fluids you may have come across before in science will typically be Newtonian, as these are relatively simple fluids. So Newtonian is constant in terms of its viscosity with changes in both shear rate and time. So a typical one is water, as it doesn't matter how quickly you stir it or how long you stir it for, it's going to flow at the exact same rate, as you can see on this graph here, with the shear stress and shear rate producing a linear relationship, which means that no matter how fast I stir it, it's going to have the exact same value. However, not all fluids are Newtonian and do not follow this equation, produce only one value. And these can change either due to the amount of time you apply a force for, so how long you stir it for, or how fast you stir it. These things then come down to these subtopics. So fluid, which reduces in viscosity with shearing time. So if I were to stir something for a really long time and it thins down, this is known as thixotropic. So you can see that on this graph here with its viscosity, so its resistance to flow, reducing as I continue to stir it. And the opposite to that is rheopectic. So in this case, as I stir it over a duration of time, the exact same rate, but over a longer period of time, this will cause it to gradually increase in viscosity. So that means that as I continue stirring, it will become harder and harder to stir. And it's not just due to the fatigue in my arm, but actually due to the way that the fluid is responding. And then on the other hand, you have things which are time independent and are instead dependent on how fast we shear it, the shear rate. So one which is quite common around the house, as you'll find out today, are pseudoplastic fluids. So in this case, as I increase the rate at which I am shearing it, so as I stir it, going faster and faster and faster, the fluid will become thinner. So you can see that here, with it gradually easing off in terms of the relationship between shear stress and shear rate, and in terms of viscosity. As that shear rate increases, you can see it gradually going down. And then the opposite to that is dilatant. In this case, as I stir it faster and faster and faster, the fluid will resist more and more and more. And this is shown with an increase in viscosity as I increase the amount of force I'm applying, whereas a Newtonian fluid would just stay exactly the same. As with here, no matter what shear stress you're using, it will always be linearly proportional to shear rate. And if I were to put it here, it would also stay exactly the same over a duration of time. The only time when you may find a clear change would be in terms of temperature or pressure, which both can have an effect on both Newtonian and non-Newtonian fluids. So typically with things like water, if you heat it up, it will flow faster. Sorry, flow more readily. It will be easier to flow. But we won't go too much into detail with that today, as I sadly don't have a hot plate to hand to demonstrate. But that is something else you guys can try out at home. And then, on the other hand, there is another one, which is slightly weird. So these are known as Bingham plastic fluids, also known as yield stress fluids. So up to a certain force, there will be completely no flow whatsoever. It will just act like a solid, it just won't flow. But above this yield stress, the flow will start to become linear as a function of strain rate. So it will become like a Newtonian fluid. But this only happens after you reach a particular shear rate. So I'll give you an example later, I won't spoil the fun. As well as this, we also have a phenomenon known as viscoelasticity. And in this case, you have materials which have components of both being viscous, so flowing like a liquid, and being elastic, so being springy. So if I were to give this a mechanical equivalence, you would refer to the elastic component as being a bit like a spring, whereas the viscous component would be like a dashpot, so like spring dashpot you may find in your cars. So instead, we'll absorb it rather than spring back out. And then to understand how these things come together, there are a variety of models looking at how these things relate to one another, which you're more than welcome to look up later. These are the Maxwell models, where you have them in series, then you have them in parallel with the Kevin Voigt model, and then you can have two in parallel, two in series. So it can relate to how these fluids will behave. But rather than focus too much on that, we'll just go through the basic definitions. So the viscous element is fluid's ability to resist shear flow and strain linearly when under stress. And we will refer to this as gamma double prime, which is our loss modulus. Whereas the elastic part is when the strain, when stretched, when the fluid will strain when stretched. So like taking a spring and stretching out, strain out, but then return to its original state when the stress is removed. This is known as gamma prime. And this is your storage modulus. And to understand how a fluid rates on this scale, we have something called the phase angle, which gives us the ratio of the viscous to elastic moduli, so that each of these fluids can be given an angle to relate to how they interact with one another. So if you have a phase angle of nothing, 0, this is a complete solid, so a bit like the wooden worktop I have here, which is never going to flow away, thank goodness. Whereas if it's 90 degrees, you have a complete liquid, so it has no elasticity whatsoever, which is what you would expect with something like water. And we'll go through this a little bit more later, as you'll be surprised just how many fluids can actually show these properties. And if you want to test them out at home later that I don't cover today, there are a couple of little tests you can have a go at doing. So if you were to take your fluid and put it in a cup or in a jar, and then put in a rod and spin it round and round, a Newtonian fluid would have the fluid curving downwards with a little internal dip towards the rod. Whereas if it's viscoelastic, instead of going down, the fluid will start to climb up the rod, going higher and higher until it reaches your fingertips. So this is quite a nice, quick way of doing it. Also, this can have effects in industry. So when you want to extrude something like a polymer, a plastic, if it's Newtonian, it will just come out nicely in a nice straight line. But if it's viscoelastic, you'll get this swell which surges out around the edges. So these are a couple of ways in which you can test some of your fluids later on. Maybe if you were to squeeze something out of a tube or to just spin it in a pot. So in industry and in research like myself, we need to be able to numerically characterize these properties, and we can't just do that by swishing it around in a cup. So there are a couple of methods we have to study complex fluids like non-Newtonian fluids. And we do this in simple flows, and this study is known as rheology, so the study of these complex fluids, non-Newtonians in simple flows, which is the opposite of things like fluid dynamics, which you would also learn if you do something like mechanical-based engineering, although this is also very much covered in materials, and we'll be focusing more on the materials side today. So in this case, you would look at simple fluids in complex flows. So we'd understand things like pipes and the way water flows throughout different systems. The way we measure these things are using shear and extensional rheometers. So a shear rheometer is something I use quite regularly, which involves either a pair of plates with fluid in between them, or a cone and a plate below it with fluid in between it. And then the cone or plate on the top will spin round and round. And the machine being used to do this will know the amount of force, so the amount of strain or the amount of stress being applied to allow this rotation to happen. And it can measure the resistance from the fluid to understand its viscosity or its other properties, such as its viscoelastic properties, by doing it in a frequency, going back, full, and that allows you to know how elastic the fluid is. So these things are really good for understanding how readily something will flow. So is it very viscous? Is it going to have a lot of resistance if I try and stir it? Or is it very low in viscosity? Is it just going to flow everywhere and take no effort to stir at all? Another way of looking at this is also with extensional rheology. So instead of turning it round and round between a plate and a cone or two plates, you will pull the fluid apart. So in this case, you'll have a bottom plate, put the fluid on, top plate, and then gradually bring them apart and then allow them to neck in and gradually break. And this allows us to understand the response of the fluid, how it separates, how elastic it is, and also gives us another idea of how these things behave together. These tests are similar to tensile tests that you may do in school, where you take a solid material and you gradually break it apart to see how it necks in and fractures. But today we'll just be going through what these fluids are. If you want to know anything more on this, please do pop me either a question at the end if you are watching this live, or put something in the comments if you're watching this on YouTube. But we'll be starting in a place where there are lots of fluids, which is the bathroom. So here we have 3 examples, which I'll be going through in a bit, including water, shampoos and conditioners, and toothpaste. So we'll start with the simple one. So water is a Newtonian fluid, which means that no matter how fast I stir it or how long I stir it, so no matter what shear force I'm applying, it will flow exactly the same. and will have the exact same viscosity for any shear rate or shear time, with a linear relationship between the amount of stress applied and the shear rate. And in this case, the viscosity is defined as 1 millipascal. And then we use these values to compare how viscous a fluid is. So 1 is very low. And then you can have something which is really high, like some of the inks I'll talk to you about later, which can go up to the hundreds. Pascals, not even millipascals. But so water is a nice, simple fluid. So I'll give you my little demo. And if I get a little chopstick, doesn't matter how fast I stir it or how long I stir it, it will always behave that exact viscosity. Moving on to something a little bit more complex. So toothpaste is actually a Bingham plastic. And what this means is that if I apply a certain amount of force, a certain shear rate, it won't budge at all. So you might find that when you're trying to push your toothpaste out, you won't get any flow, and then suddenly it flows, and at which point it behaves in a more Newtonian manner. And this can also be seen here, where there's absolutely nothing until you reach that critical shear stress. So this shear stress isn't defined here as it's different for whatever toothpaste you use, as they all have different components. But if I were to demonstrate this, here I have my toothpaste. So if I squeeze it with a certain amount, there is completely no flow. And then I reach that critical yield stress, and it all comes out at one single rate. Yeah. And then I'm going to try and squeeze it back in, because I don't have enough to waste. Put the lid on. But that is a really nice one. You can test at home and think about the next time you brush your teeth. And try and figure out exactly what force it is that allows you to actually get it to squeeze out. But moving on to our next fluids. So shampoo and conditioner are both viscoelastic, so they have some elasticity when they flow. So if I were to try and squeeze it out of the tube, you may find that some of it goes back in the tube, quite elastic. It just springs back into where it came from rather than just flowing out nicely. And they are also pseudoplastic, so shear thinning. So as I was to stir them, it would cause them to become easier and easier to flow. So you can see that on our basic graph here, with the amount of shear stress being required to produce a certain shear rate becoming less and less. Or in this case, with the viscosity gradually reducing as I increase the force. And in this case, it's because when it starts out, the particles are randomly orientated, and then they will start to align. So if I stop sharing and show you my little containers. So here I have some conditioner, and here I have some shampoo. So at the moment, it's quite high viscosity. You know that because if I hold it on its side, you can't see it flowing all that much. I mean, it is flowing, but it's incredibly slow. I could probably hold it upside down and it's not going to land on my hand anytime soon. But as I fin it and I stir it, stirry, 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 it will start to flow a little bit more readily. And it's the exact same with my shampoo. So the shampoo is actually higher initial viscosity than my conditioner, so it's actually even harder to get to flow. Although it completely depends on what shampoo and conditioner you have, as all of them will have different components. So if I then use my chopstick and I start to stir it round and round, around, 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 actually tell it's elastic as well. If I try and get the right angle, even though I have it right, it's actually all starting to agglomerate in one bit and then gradually spread back out. So it's both thinning down but also acting like an elastic. Try and get it in the right place. But then it does flow a little bit more readily. Though still has a high enough viscosity that it's not quite going to reach my hand unless I apply more force, which is why you'll find that you'd probably need to shake your conditioners and your shampoos before you can get them out of the container, because the more you shake them, the more readily they will flow. So putting them to one side, and going back to the presentation. So how exactly does this work? So pseudoplastic fluids, so shear thinning fluids, are typically containing particles in a polymer plastic dispersion, as is the case for shampoos and conditioners. And when they are at low shear, so when they're resting, your particles can be randomly dispersed at a variety of different angles, and your polymer chains, which are long, elasticy chains, can be all coiled up and not exactly stretched out. But when we start to apply a flow, this will allow the particles and the polymer chains to become orientated in terms of particles and stretch out in terms of the chains. And this allows them to be orientated in terms of the direction of flow, which allows them to flow more regularly, as you don't have the resistance from the particles blocking one another. And this is the case for a lot of shear thinning fluids, as we will discuss later. So, moving on to the next room. What happens in the kitchen? So today we're going to go through a variety of different foods, which I all have with me. So this will include mayonnaise, some potato starch, some olive oil, ketchup, and yogurt. So before we go in, I'd like you guys to try and think what sort of fluid types these things might be and see if what you think it is actually the case. So let's start with mayonnaise. So mayonnaise is relatively complex in terms of that it's both thixotropic and a Bingham fluid. So what this means is that until I reach a certain amount of shear force, it's not going to flow. But when you do reach that point, in terms of the amount of shear stress versus shear rate, it will then behave in a Newtonian manner. However, this is also affected not only by the amount of shear stress, so the shear rate, so it's not just how fast we stir it, but also how long we stir it for. So as we stir it for longer and longer, gradually that viscosity will reduce, meaning that it will flow more readily over time. If I can give you a little demonstration on that, I will grab my mayonnaise. So this is a garlic mayo. I just wipe off the spatula. So until a certain force it won't flow, but I'm applying enough force that it can flow anyway. But then if I continue doing the same amount of force but over a longer and longer time period, it will start to break down the structure, the molecular structure, particles that allow it to flow more readily, which I can start to feel now. It's quite hard to show on the screen, but although I'm applying the exact same shear rate that I was earlier, it is now flowing a lot easier. So I will now put this back to one side. The next time you are using mayo, maybe have a little play and understand how it flows and how long you need to stir it before it starts to become a bit thinner. So we go back, we can now continue on. So mayonnaise is more complex than we may have given it credit for. The next one on my list is ketchup. So something that a lot of people like having on their sides. This is also a Bingham fluid. Not a sheer, it's not a fixed tropic Bingham fluid, so it's not going to thin down the longer I stir it, but it is a Bingham fluid, just as with our toothpaste. Which I find quite surprising because I didn't realise this was the case. So if I go back to my screen, I can show you the little pot I have in front of me. So here we are. Here is our ketchup, and you can actually believe it's a Bingham fluid, as I can hold it at most angles, and although it's slithering around on the water at the bottom, it's pretty much staying perfectly in shape. However, when I apply enough of a shear force, so in this case it requires 15 pascals or more, it will then flow readily with the shear stress produced in proportional to the shear rate. Which is quite an interesting thing to think about. So 15 pascals is quite low, but it's something you could try later. If we go back onto the screen, we can then have a look at the next thing I found in the kitchen. So this is my particular favourite. So far we've mainly been looking at fluids which thin, either with shearing time or shearing rate, or then start flowing at a particular yield stress. Whereas water and potato starch, or water and cornstarch, corn flour, have the exact opposite reaction. So in this case, as you increase the rate of shear, the particles will start to interlock with flow, and this leads to a higher viscosity, which I find quite fascinating. So if I stop sharing and go back to my screen, here I have a cup of my potato starch and water, which if I were to hold up here and gradually push my finger through, it will allow me to get my finger in. But if I try and pull it out quickly, I get a lot of resistance. So if I try and pick some of this up and I start pushing it hard, it behaves like a solid. But as soon as I stop applying that force, it behaves like a liquid. But then once I start tapping it again, suddenly it turns into something I can almost sculpt with. So if I try this with a bigger blob, it's incredibly weird stuff, and it's something you can easily make at home with either potato starch or cornstarch and water. And if you want to make a putty, you can just combine this with some liquid soap, a little bit of dye, and then you can play it along with it. It is a very weird fluid, especially as now I'm trying to apply a force, it's just going to flake off rather than go off as a nice liquid. Some very, very odd stuff. I demonstrate that also by jabbing it with my chopstick. But first I will allow the chopstick to go in. So here you can see my chopstick is pretty much in. But if I try and pull it out, it takes a lot of force. You can almost hear a squelch. And if I instead want to hit this really hard with the chopstick, it will resist. You can almost see the dents I'm making as I do that. So now you can even see all the little bits which have gone flying around as I've done that, which will now turn into gloopy liquid to stop moving it. But how does that work? Well, let's explore. So in the case of a shear thickening dilatant fluid. Instead of the particles forming really nice, long flowing chains or coming orientated to the flow, they behave quite differently. So this occurs in high concentration dispersion. So an example you may find if you go outside is quicksand, because that is a very high concentration dispersion of sand in water. And at high shear, it changes quite dramatically. So if we start it when it's at rest, we have our particles evenly distributed. So in this case, we've got our long long potato starch molecules and our molecules of water, and they're nice and even, and when at low shear will allow them to flow like a liquid. However, if you apply high shear, like me thudding it down just then, this causes the particles to interlock. In this case, they all start to jam with one another, with the water molecules flowing out, leaving you with a solid. This prevents it from flowing readily, and is the reason why if you were to make enough of this and fill a bathtub, you could probably run across it. I'm not suggesting you do that in a bathtub by any means, but if you were even just to make this at home and just start jabbing it with your fingers, you would find that they aren't going to go anywhere. Right, where if I put it in gently and take it out gently, then it allows me to go the whole way through, and I come out with dripping potato starch and water fluid. This is actually a really interesting one. If you have any crusts at home, which is very starchy, any potato starch, any cornstarch, then you're welcome to have a go at doing this, as it is rather fun. Moving on to something which I have quite a lot of the time, that is yogurt. So in this case, this is both thixotropic, so shear thins over time, and pseudoplastic, so it shear thins also with the rate. So if I were to stir it for a long time, it would thin down. If I were to stir it faster, it would thin down. If I were to stir it faster for a long time, then it would really thin down. So this is quite an interesting material. However, the rheological properties of yogurt are quite important for its texture and its taste. So in the food industry, they do actually do quality checks on the rheological properties with any yogurt which has too low a viscosity or something that has been permanently thixotropically thinned down, then that is far less appealing to the consumer than a nice, thick, creamy yogurt. So these are actually things which are tested not only in engineering, but also in the food industry, and is done for quite a lot of fluids. But where would I be if I missed out the Newtonians? So although it is substantially thicker and more viscous than water, olive oil is in fact, well, all vegetable oils are in fact Newtonian, which means that according to the shear stress you're applying, you will have a linear shear rate reaction, and no matter how much force I apply, so how fast I stir or how long I stir it for, it will have the exact same viscosity, which for olive oil is around 100 millipascals. So it's 100 times more resistant than water, but is still completely Newtonian and will follow all of the Newtonian equations. Moving on to my favorite location, the bedroom. So in my case, in there you will find a variety of paints, inks and pastes, some putties, and maybe some plasticine for modeling. So in the case of plasticine, this, as with our toothpaste, our ketchup, and our mayonnaise, is in fact a Bingham plastic, although this has a substantially higher yield stress than the previous fluids at 10,000 pascals, which is why at rest plasticine is very much a solid, which is why we can use it for modeling, as when we apply a shear stress, it enables us to reposition the plasticine, but when we leave it alone, it will happily stay in place for as long as it needs to. And the values I have here are the actual viscosity graphs you can get for plasticine, as was found in the Barnes Non-Newtonian Fluid Mechanics book, which you can look up if you are really interested in learning more about rheology. And it shows that you have a really significant reduction in viscosity as you change the shear stress, although there isn't that significant a change to begin with, or so it would appear. Something you should probably note is that this graph is on a logarithmic scale, so it's not actually representative of what we would expect. So although it looks like a very small change up here, this is actually quite a significant change. It's in a far higher factor than down here. So that's something to bear in mind. Normally we do actually show things on a log scale because, as you would have learned in GCSE and A-level maths, this allows us to see the change of the trends a lot clearer if you have smaller changes occurring at very, very small values later on. So I will give you a little demonstration with the plasticine I got earlier. So as you saw on screen, I have a variety of plasticines. And if I were to take a little bit out and I hold it in the palm of my hand, this isn't going to flow anywhere. This is quite happily sitting there like a solid because it's incredibly highly viscous at rest. But then when I apply enough shear stress, so at least 10,000 pascals, I can start to get it to flow like a liquid and model it into whatever shape I want it to be. This is a very nice one for anyone into anything arty. But my particular favourite out of the weird ones is definitely putties. If I grab my putty, this is a shear thickening, so dilatant, viscoelastic fluid. So this will thicken as I apply a greater shear force, which is why it's quite hard to get out of its case, as when I put it in, it was behaving like a solid. But when I sealed it, it became like a liquid and allowed it to flow all over my container, which you can see if I hold it up to the camera, as it has completely filled my container. But if I am now to put it out, as it is shear thickening and elastic, it will come out just as one bubble. And now if I start to apply a force to it again, we can show the shear thickening nature. So at low shear, if I pull this very, very slowly, I will do this on the big screen. So if I put it really, really slowly, you'll see that it will flow like a liquid, down and down and down, flowing continuously. Ugh. And going absolutely everywhere. But if I put this back to one bit, if I now take it and I pull it with a far greater shear stress, it will fracture like a solid. So this is demonstrating viscoelastic and shear thickening properties. So viscoelastic is quite a nice demonstration on here, because you can see how it has the ability to flow nicely like a liquid, but with a great enough force will behave like an elastic, fancy solid, and can pretty much become a really nice fancy ball. However, putties aren't just cool for playing around with all day long. They are quite a nice bit of stress relief. But the properties of putties can also be utilised in actual commercial products. So there is a group, a British group, who produce a putty-like structure known as the Frio, which is made up of polyurethane and silicon. And this enables it to be produced when combined with a few other things as a foam, which is molded into a particular shape. And this foam can be used to absorb shock and therefore prevent damage. So in things like motorcycle clothes, so that if you fall off your motorcycle, it can absorb the shock and prevent you from having severe damage. It can also be used in military clothes. So if I demonstrate now, if I were to put this on my arm, now that I'm flowing it slowly, has the ability to stretch and move when my arm moves. So if I maybe lie here where I have a joint, you can see when I flex my arm, it will move with me. But if, say, a bullet or a knife were very, very quickly to come at me, and I don't get it all sticky, it will absorb the shock, which is far easier when I hit it. Another way I can demonstrate this is to hit my finger. So if I were to wrap this around my finger and place it down on the table, so you can see my finger is definitely inside, and I hit it, I feel absolutely nothing. And I can do this all day long. Because although my finger is inside, this absorbs all of the shock for me. Similarly, when produced as a foam-like material and used in military clothing, motorcycle clothing, sportswear for contact sports, this can prevent a lot of injuries and can also now be found used in some phone and laptop cases to absorb shock for them as well and prevent them from being damaged. So this has a lot of properties, although most of the time I just enjoy it to play around with, stretch and bounce. But if I go back to the screen, if you want more information, you are welcome to look up the Frio, as you'll be able to find a range of the products they have available and see for yourselves just how this lovely stuff, these sorts of properties, can be used to really help people who need it. But moving on, the fluid, I must admit I know a fair bit amount. So paint, inks and pastes, these are very much shear thinning fluids. So in the case of paint, it's quite beneficial for it to be shear thinning, because when you apply it to, say, your wall, you want it to flow readily when you brush it on to give a nice even coating. When you stop brushing it on, you don't want it to drip down the wall and end up on the floor, which is why its recovery to go back to its initial viscosity and stay in place is incredibly handy. So how shear thinning a fluid is depends on a variety of things. When it comes to inks and pastes, it can be the type of resin used, the size of the pigments, the amount of pigments used, or the dyes used, and all of their concentrations. These can all have really big effects. As well as that, inks are also very viscoelastic. So they also, as my putty, have the ability to behave like a flowing liquid, or if you pull them apart, an elastic solid, which has the ability to neck and separate in ways that you would not expect of a fluid. So there are a variety of properties which can influence this, and in turn influence how they are processed. So in printing, you have a variety of different print presses, but these are all dependent on the viscosity of a fluid, because with things like screen printing that I use, which has been covered in some of the previous talks, this can take very high viscosity fluids, so things with big particles or lots of particles in high concentrations, which will resist a lot of shear and will therefore flow far less readily than other suspensions, which are better, things like inkjet, where you want something far lower in viscosity, closer to that of water even. And those all influence the type of products you can make. So to give you an idea of what the viscosity profile of this looks like, I will first give you a little demonstration. So here in front of me, I have a little pot of carbon-based ink. And if I get the lid off, I can show you that at rest. So this is a carbon-based ink, like the ones I use to screen print things, like resistive heaters. So what you have here is a conductive heater track, which when connected to a power supply, which has current running through it, will allow it to heat up. But this is so high viscosity when it's at no shear, I can hold this over my hand for quite a long time with full confidence that it's not going to drop on me. But just so you know that it's not just a shiny thing in there, I can now get my paintbrush, and if I go round and round and round, if I start slowly, you can see it's got quite a lot of resistance. But as I go faster and faster, this will start to flow more and more readily until I would definitely not want to hold this over my head, because even holding it on the side means that it's almost coming out. So this is incredibly shear thinning due to the fact that it has lots of particles of a variety of sizes in it and lots of polymer chains, all of which become better aligned when you apply a flow, which is fantastic for screen printing because it means when you start out, the ink can just sit on the top of the screen, and then when you apply a force, will flow readily, go on to the pattern you want. But then when you release it, means that when it goes back to its initial viscosity, so it becomes far harder to flow, will enable it to keep the exact pattern that you have put down. So, but it's also quite elastic. So if I demonstrate pulling this out, you can see that it has quite a large trail of ink continuously going between it. And I have to pull it quite far to get it to separate. And even when it does separate, I hold it in front of my face, you can actually see that it still goes springing back up to the paintbrush rather than going down to the pot. And like a spring, it's going up and down, and springing its way back up. And these properties determine, in things like screen printing, how the ink separates from the screen onto whatever you're printing onto. So in the case of my little demonstration here, a bit of cork so you can make a heat up coaster. And just to give you a demonstration of what this would look like on a graph, I have some of my data from my own work. So we go to the next screen. What you see here are the rheology graphs for the shear thinning nature of the ink, showing how as you increase the shear rate from nothing up to 100 per second, it will gradually reduce in viscosity, going up from 50 pascals seconds down to around 8. So it's quite a significant reduction, which means it goes from acting like something which is practically a solid that I can hold over my head to a very fast flowing liquid, which would go all over my head. And another thing to consider with this, especially when you're drip printing, is how long it takes to go back to its original viscosity. So what you have here is 3 different sections where you start off with the fluid at its initial viscosity, so around 50 odd, when applied for long enough. And then quickly, you'll see the drop when I increase the shear rate to 100 seconds. It's an instantaneous drop in viscosity down to what you would get at 100. And I hold it there for around 60 seconds. And then after that, I go back to 1, which is practically standstill, and I can find out how long it takes for my viscosity to go back up to where it started. In this case, it's around a minute. And this is something you need to bear in mind, because if you're printing, this is how long it's going to take for your fluid to stop flowing readily. And this is how long it has to start to slump and settle into whatever pattern it is. So if you have lots of rough bits, this can allow them to become smoother. So these are all really, really important things for anyone who is in the printing industry, making electronics, and also for anyone who deals with other fluids. So things like blood are also very important to measure the rheological properties of, as it helps us to understand how it flows through the body. So it's lots of different things like that. And another little graph relates to what I went through at the beginning. So this is showing how its elastic and viscous response changes as I increase frequency. So how quickly I am turning the ink back and forth on that cone and plate rheometer I mentioned earlier. So here I have my cone and below I have a plate, and I'm turning the ink back, forth at a given frequency. And as I increase that rate, you see a change in this phase angle, which I mentioned earlier, where 0 is a solid and 100 is pure liquid. And this changes with the frequency from around 35 down to around 25 and back up to around 40 as it changes its response. So it's not just a case of I go quicker, it becomes more elastic, or I go slower, it becomes more elastic. It's actually something that will change gradually and over a range of different rates. And in this case, what I'm seeing is this is actually a very elastic ink because it's far closer to 0. And when I'm at frequency approaching 1, it is most elastic. And when I'm at a frequency approaching 10, it is most viscous, so most flowing. So these are all things you have to bear in mind because it determines how that ink is going to pull apart, whether it's going to spring back towards itself or allow it to nicely separate. These are all actually really interesting things for someone in my field, and are all things you can learn if you go into things like material science, and you can even get to do some of these tests yourselves. So in summary, we have been through all the different types of fluids you can find in the house. Of course, there are many more, so if you've really enjoyed this, please do apply the knowledge you've learned here and identify other things you can find. So in the case of Newtonian fluids, these are things which have a constant viscosity with time and shear rate. No matter what you do, it's going to flow the same. But many household fluids are non-Newtonian. So things like shampoos, conditioners, and paints will flow more the more readily you mix them, so the faster you mix them. Things like toothpaste, mayonnaise, and ketchup have a yield stress, after which point they will flow. Putties and custard and potato starch become thicker as you apply more shear. And many other fluids can act like both an elastic solid or a flowing liquid according to how you treat them. So I hope you have enjoyed this session, and I will take questions now.